welcome back to MLX. If this is your first night with us, settle in. This is the place where old, quiet stories are told slowly, gently, and only for the purpose of helping you fall asleep. There is nothing to remember here, nothing to follow closely, nothing to solve. Just my voice, low and unhurried, keeping you company as the night goes on. Come in and settle yourself somewhere warm. Pull the blanket up over your shoulders. Let your eyes grow heavy and allow your breathing to slow. Tonight, you do not need to think about anything at all. Tonight, you only need to listen and drift and rest. We are going back, far back to the early 1800s, to a stretch of coastline where the land ends abruptly in dark, wet cliffs, and where the sea beyond stretches out gray and endless toward a horizon no one has ever fully mapped. Somewhere along that coastline, perched on the edge of the rock where the wind never truly stops, there stands a lighthouse. You can almost picture it now, can't you? Tall and pale, built of thick granite blocks, stacked one upon another by hands that ached in the cold. Its walls are round, smooth, worn soft at the edges by 100 years of salt spray. At its very top sits a great glass lantern room, and inside that lantern room, a light burns quietly through the night, turning, sweeping its long golden beam out across the black water tonight. And for the next 2 hours, you are the keeper of that light. There is no need to hurry through this story. There is nowhere else you need to be. Let your mind settle into the slow rhythm of another century. A century without electricity in most homes, without engines roaring through the night, without screens glowing in the dark. Only oil lamps, only candlelight, only the patient turning of gears and the patient turning of the sea. Imagine, if you will, the sound of waves far below, striking the base of the rock again and again, softly, steadily, like a great slow heartbeat that has been beating since long before you arrived and will go on beating long after you are gone. Imagine the wind moving around the tower, not violent tonight, just present, just constant, brushing against the old stone like a hand, smoothing a blanket. You live here now. You keep this light, somewhere far off, beyond the edge of what you can see. Ships move through the darkness, their captains watching for the exact beam you tend, trusting it to guide them safely past the rocks that have claimed so many vessels before. It is a heavy responsibility, and yet tonight it feels almost peaceful to imagine yourself standing at the top of the tower, wrapped in a woolen coat, watching the light do its slow, faithful work. Let yourself imagine the lighthouse as it truly was in those years, not glamorous, not not exciting, but plain, hard, and quiet. A modest cottage attached to the base of the tower, its windows small against the wind. A narrow spiral staircase of worn stone steps curling upward through the dark, lit only by the small lamp you carry in your hand. The smell of oil and salt and old wood mixing together into something that, after enough months, begins to smell simply like home. There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over a place like this as evening falls. The gulls stop crying. The fishing boats, if any were near, turn back toward harbor long before dusk. And you are left with only the sound of the sea, the sound of the wind, and the low creak of the tower settling into the falling temperature of the night. As we move through this story together, we will walk slowly through the life of a lighthouse keeper in this era. The long days of quiet labor, the storms that tested every nerve, the loneliness that settled deep into the bones, and the strange, humble beauty that made it all, somehow, bearable. There is no need to remember any of it. There is no need to follow every detail. Simply let the words wash over you the way the waves wash over the rocks below, over and over, soft and unhurried. Somewhere in the telling, your eyes will grow heavier. Your thoughts will begin to drift, the way a small boat drifts on a calm sea, gently, without direction, without worry. And that is exactly as it should be, so take one more slow breath. Let your shoulders fall, and let us begin, gently, the story of the lighthouse and the quiet, aching, endlessly patient life of the one who kept its light burning through the dark. In the 1800s, becoming a lighthouse keeper was not a decision made lightly, and it was rarely a decision made for excitement. It was, more often, a decision made out of necessity, a way to earn a small, steady wage in a world where steady wages were hard to come by. Picture the sort of men, and in some cases, women who took up this work. Many had once been sailors themselves, weathered by years at sea, their hands scarred from rope and rigging, their faces lined from squinting into salt wind, having grown too old, too injured, or simply too tired for a life aboard a ship. They turned instead to a different relationship with the ocean, not sailing across it, but watching over it from a fixed and steady point. Others came from fishing families who understood the moods of the sea better than they understood the moods of people. They knew how to read a sky heavy with coming rain. They knew the particular gray of clouds that meant a storm was still hours away, and the different gray that meant it was already upon you. This knowledge, learned young, made them well suited to a post where survival depended on understanding whether before weather understood you. Still others were simply men with families to feed and few other opportunities. A keeper's post, however isolated, however difficult, offered a small government salary, a roof over one's head, and a sense of purpose. In an age before insurance, before search and rescue services, before any of the safety nets we take for granted now, a lighthouse keeper's work was one of the few jobs that came with the quiet dignity of literally saving lives. The pay itself was modest. In many countries, a keeper might earn barely enough to clothe and feed a family, and often the work required an entire household to help a wife managing the household stores, older children hauling oil or trimming wicks, everyone contributing in some small way to keep the light burning every single night without fail. Because that was the one unbreakable rule of the profession. The light could never go dark. Not for illness, not for grief, not for storm. You can imagine what sort of temperament this demanded. Patience, first and foremost, patience, so deep it became almost a form of stillness. A tolerance for solitude that most people simply did not possess. A quiet, steady discipline, the kind that gets up at the same hour every day regardless of how the body feels, regardless of how the heart feels, and climbs the same stairs, and performs the same tasks, one after another, without complaint. Many keepers described their work not as adventure, but as service, a duty owed to sailors they would never meet. On ships they would never see up close, whose lives depended entirely on whether the flame stayed lit and the lens stayed clean. There was a kind of honor in that, a private, unspoken honor that did not need applause or witnesses, because the only witnesses were the dark sea and the distant lights of passing ships. Of course, not everyone who applied for the post understood, at first, exactly what they were signing up for. The advertisements and government postings spoke of steady wages and lodging provided. They said little of the months of isolation, the constant damp, the endless repetitive labor, or the particular loneliness of watching a ship's lights pass by on the horizon, carrying people toward warm, lit harbors, while you remained behind on your rock, alone with the wind. And yet, once settled into the rhythm of the work, many keepers came to feel something almost like peace in it. The predictability, the silence, the sense of being needed by something larger than themselves, even if that something never spoke back, never thanked them, never even knew their names. Let yourself imagine now that you are one of these people. Not brave in any dramatic sense, not seeking glory, simply willing to live a quiet, difficult life, high above a restless sea, so that others might find their way safely home. As we continue, we will follow you to your very first arrival at such a post, and the strange, hollow feeling of stepping onto that rock for the first time, watching the boat that brought you turn back toward shore, and realizing slowly that you are now, for the foreseeable future, entirely alone. The boat that brought you to the lighthouse was small, old, and built for exactly this kind of work, ferrying keepers, supplies, and the occasional inspector out to isolated rocks that no larger vessel could safely approach. You remember the crossing well, even now, though it happened only this morning. The sea had been calm enough for the season, gray-green and gently rolling. But even a gentle sea feels enormous when you are seated low in a small wooden boat, watching the shoreline shrink slowly behind you. The oarsman said little. He had made this trip more times than he could count, ferrying keeper after keeper out to this same lonely rock, and he seemed to understand, without needing to say so, that this was not a moment for conversation. You watched the lighthouse grow larger as you approached, rising up out of the water like something ancient, something that had always been there and always would be, long after you and everyone you knew had turned to dust. It was taller than you had imagined from the drawings you had been shown before accepting the post. Pale stone, streaked here and there with the dark green of old lichen, standing against a sky the color of wet slate. As the boat drew nearer, you began to make out the details, the narrow iron rail circling the gallery near the top, the small windows dotting the tower's height like buttons on a coat, the low stone cottage crouched at its base, its chimney sending up a thin, steady thread of smoke left over from the previous keeper's final fire landing, was its own small ordeal. There was no proper harbor here, only a narrow, slick landing stage cut into the rock, where the boat had to be timed carefully against the rise and fall of the swell. You remember gripping the gunwale, waiting for the exact moment the boatman called out, and then stepping quickly, carefully, onto the wet stone, your boots slipping slightly before finding their footing. The cold hit you first. Even though it was not yet winter, the wind out here carried none of the softness it held on land. It came straight off the open ocean, unbroken by hills or trees or buildings, and it moved through your coat as though the wool were nothing more than paper. The air smelled of salt, of seaweed drying on the rocks, of the particular mineral coldness of stone that that has never once been warmed all the way through by the sun. You stood for a long moment, simply looking up at the tower, feeling smaller than you had ever felt in your life. From the base, it seemed to stretch impossibly high, its whitewashed walls curving gently away from you, disappearing into the low gray clouds that hung over the coast that day. The previous keeper, an older man with a quiet, weathered face, met you at the door of the cottage. He said little beyond the practical, where the oil was stored, how the fog bell mechanism worked, which steps on the spiral stair had a tendency to creak in a way that meant they needed attention before they gave way entirely. He handed you the heavy iron key to the lantern room, and in his eyes you saw something you would come to understand only later. Relief, mixed with something that might have been pity, mixed with something that might have been envy. By the time the boat pulled away again, carrying the old keeper back toward the mainland, the light was beginning to fade from the sky. You stood at the edge of the landing stage and watched the small vessel grow smaller and smaller until it was only a dark speck against the gray water, and then nothing at all. And then, quite suddenly, you were alone. Not alone in the way one is alone in a quiet room in a house full of sleeping family. Alone in a way that stretched outward in every direction. Alone with the sea. Alone with the wind. Alone with the enormous, patient silence of the rock beneath your feet. Somewhere above you, the lantern room waited, its great lens catching the last dim light of the day, waiting for you to climb the stairs and begin your work. You took a breath. You turned toward the tower, and slowly, one careful step at a time, you began to climb. Morning at the lighthouse begins before the sun has fully decided to rise. You wake in the small stone cottage, the air cool against your face, even beneath the layers of wool blankets. And for a moment, you simply lie still, listening to the wind test the shutters, listening to the waves working steadily against the rocks below, patient as they have always been. There is comfort, oddly enough, in the fact that your first task each day is always the same. In a life with so few certainties, the morning routine of a lighthouse keeper offered something steady to hold on to. A sequence of small, careful actions that, performed correctly, kept both the light and the keeper alive through another day. You rise, dress in the same practical clothing. You wear nearly every day thick trousers, a heavy wool jumper, a waxed coat if the weather demands it, and begin the climb up the spiral staircase toward the lantern room. The stairs themselves are old stone, worn smooth, and faintly concave in the center from decades of boots climbing exactly this same path. Your candle lamp throws a small, warm circle of light onto the curving walls as you go, the shadows shifting and stretching with each step. At the top, the lantern room greets you with its enormous glass panes, fogged faintly with the night's condensation. And beyond them, the pale gray beginnings of dawn spreading slowly across the water. Your first task is always to extinguish the lamp, carefully, methodically, making certain the flame is fully out before you begin the far more delicate work of the day. Cleaning the lens comes next, and it is not a task to be rushed. The great Fresnel lens, a marvel of glass and brass, its concentric rings bending and focusing the lamp's flame into a single powerful beam that can be seen for many miles out at sea, collects soot from the burning oil overnight, along with salt residue carried in on the sea air. You take up a soft cloth and you begin to wipe the glass panel by panel, working in slow, careful circles, taking care never to press too hard, never to scratch the delicate surface that so many lives, quite literally, depend upon. The lamp itself requires just as much attention. In these years, most lighthouses burned whale oil, or in some regions, colza oil pressed from rapeseed, feeding a wick that had to be trimmed precisely each morning to ensure a clean, steady flame come nightfall. A wick trimmed poorly might smoke, might flicker unevenly, might dim the light just enough that some captain far out at sea, squinting through fog and driving rain, might fail to see it in time. You trim the wick with small scissors kept specifically for this purpose, cutting away the charred, blackened edge until a fresh, even surface remains. You check the reservoir of oil, refilling it if needed from the heavy casks stored below. Hauling each one up the narrow stairs yourself, your shoulders aching by the time the task is done, though you have long since stopped noticing the ache as anything unusual. Beyond the lamp and lens, the morning holds a dozen smaller duties. The brass fittings around the lantern room require regular polishing to prevent the salt air from corroding them entirely. The windows must be checked for cracks or leaks. The mechanism that rotates the lens, driven in many lighthouses of this era by a heavy clockwork weight that must be wound and slowly lowered through a shaft in the center of the tower, needs winding, its gears inspected for wear. Outside, if the weather permits, there are further chores. Checking the fog bell's mechanism, inspecting the exterior stonework for cracks after the previous night's storm, tending the small garden plot, if the soil and salt spray allow anything at all to grow, drawing water, chopping what little wood or peat is available for the stove below. By the time these tasks are complete, several hours have often passed, and the morning light has fully claimed the sky. You allow yourself then a small pause, a cup of tea, perhaps, taken standing at the cottage window, looking out at the calm gray water, watching a distant fishing boat make its way along the horizon, its sails catching what thin sunlight manages to break through the clouds. There is no rush in any of this. There cannot be. The work of a keeper is not measured in speed, but in thoroughness, in reliability, in the simple, unglamorous discipline of doing the same careful things correctly every single day, so that when darkness falls again, the light will be ready. As the afternoon begins to soften into evening, your attention turns once more toward the lantern room and toward the quiet ritual of preparing the light for another night's work. There is a particular stillness to this hour. The sun, if it has shown itself at all today, begins its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the underside of the clouds in shades of amber and dull rose. The wind, which so often builds through the afternoon, sometimes eases briefly at dusk, as though the sea itself is pausing to watch the changing of the light. You climb the stairs once more, candle lamp in hand, moving through the familiar dimness of the tower's interior. Each step of this staircase is known to you now in a way that requires no thought. You know exactly which stones are worn smoother than others, exactly where the handrail feels cool, even in summer, exactly how many steps remain before the small landing halfway up, where a narrow window looks out toward the mainland, now barely visible as a low dark line against the sky. In the lantern room, the great lens waits, clean now from your morning's careful work. Its hundreds of small glass prisms catching what little light remains in the sky and scattering it into brief, fractured rainbows across the walls. You check it once more, out of habit as much as necessity, running a careful eye over every panel to be certain nothing has been missed. Then comes the lighting of the lamp itself. This is, perhaps, the single most important moment of the keeper's entire day. You trim the wick a final time, ensuring it is even and clean. You check the oil reservoir, topping it off if needed. And then, with a long match or a small burning taper, you touch flame to wick, watching carefully as it catches, as the small orange glow steadies and grows. The flame alone is modest, no larger, really, than the flame of an ordinary household lamp. But the genius of the Fresnel lens surrounding it transforms that small, humble flame into something extraordinary. The lens bends and focuses the scattered light into a single powerful beam, capable of being seen from a distance of many miles out at sea. A distance that would have seemed almost magical to anyone unfamiliar with the optical principles at work. You engage the rotation mechanism next, the heavy clockwork gears beginning their slow, patient turning, carrying the lens around in its steady circuit, casting the beam outward across the water in the particular rhythmic pattern assigned to this specific lighthouse.